Justice Barrett?
So this license thing is important to me. And do you agree that pursuant to IEPA, the president could regulate commerce by imposing a license fee?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Could the president regulate commerce under IEPA by using a licensing fee?
Not a fee. So I should have said this earlier, but license is different from a licensing fee. IEPA and TWIA authorize licenses, not license fees, and no president has ever charged, to my knowledge, fees under those two statutes for the licenses. So fees impermissible, licenses okay.
Fees permissible if they cover the costs of the scheme?
Might be. I mean, but once they start revenue raising, you implicate the most serious concerns.
But I thought you conceded to Justice Gorsuch there was no difference between a tariff and a licensing fee, functionally.
If the licensing fee is just to I didn't concede that.
Okay.
So if the licensing fee is just to recoup the cost of government services, I think that may be okay. I don't think you need to get into it. Here, the government is asserting a power which they say in their briefs to you raises $4 trillion.
So you understand the statute to permit licensing in the sense of permission.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to 45th Perspective. I'm glad you're here, and I want to thank you in advance for watching. Before we dive in, just a quick ask. If you find this discussion useful, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell so you don't miss future videos. Also, if you'd like to support what we're doing here in a more meaningful way, please consider joining our Patreon community at patreon.com/45thperspective, where for as little as $5 a month, you can help us keep delivering thoughtful commentary and analysis.
Like, we will not allow you to trade with us. We will not allow your goods to be imported unless we license it.
Absolutely. And Justice Barrett, I think like just the natural reading, if you're to look at the word licenses and think, wow, Congress smuggled this incredible power to do all of these different things that the government is doing here, 39% taxes on some countries and others, through the word license, that's
Can you license exportation?
I don't think so, for the reason that,
Well, right now, I actually looked into this. I mean, I think you, maybe not licensing fees.
Exactly.
But could you license exportation, like saying we're not going to allow certain products that have national security implications to be exported?
Yes.
So licensing could be used in that sense,
Correct.
not as a revenue raising measure.
Yes.
Okay. So you went back and forth with Justice Gorsuch about the implications of the president's authority over foreign affairs and whether the major questions doctrine applies. You say that in IEPA, the president's war powers are not implicated, and that was part of the reason why you say that we should think of this differently than some of the historical examples where the commander-in-chief power, war powers, were implicated. But the same language appears in the Trading with the Enemies Act, in which war powers would be implicated. So do you think the language should be, and of course that is what President Nixon relied on, so do you think that the language would be interpreted differently in that context, even though the commander-in-chief power and the war power would be implicated?
100%, I think, would be interpreted differently. Justice Jackson.
Same regulate commerce language.
Yes, because once you're carrying over wartime precedents to peacetime for reasons.
Okay, I don't understand that then, because everybody agrees the language in IEPA came from the Trading with the Enemy Act. So you're saying it has one meaning in the Trading with the Enemy Act and a different meaning in IEPA, that same regulate commerce?
No, I think that the conquered territory language and all of that may go to the president's Article II powers as inherent powers in conquered territory, but I don't think it gets the government where they need to go. The CAC brief and the brief by Professor Paul Stephen goes through and explains why in 1933, when Congress decided to bring these concepts into peacetime, it severed the wartime roots. And there's an extensive legislative history.
Okay, I understand that, but I thought that was about, maybe I'm just not tracking. I mean, I think there's been some discussion of whether the president would have inherent Article II authority in wartime to impose tariffs to this end. Is that what you're talking about? Are you actually talking about a statute that said regulate importation in wartime?
Right.
And you think it could have the tariff power conferred through that language, in a war-making statute, but not an IEPA?
No, I don't think it confers it in either place. I think the president, it's located, the president's power in conquered territory is not in the Trading with Enemies Act or anything like that.
Okay, so it's an inherent constitutional
Exactly.
power coming from the law of war. Okay. And then if you win, tell me how the reimbursement process would work. Would it be a complete mess? I mean, you're saying before the government promised reimbursement, and now you're saying, oh, well, that's rich. But how would this work? It seems to me like it could be a mess.
So the first thing I'd say is that just underscores just how major a question this is. The very fact that you were dealing with this with quotas, there's no refund process to the tunes of billions of dollars or embargoes, but there is here. But for our case, the way it would work is, in this case, the government stipulated for the 5 plaintiffs that they would get the refunds. So for us, that's how it would work. Your question, I take it, is about everyone else. We don't have a class action or anything like that. With respect to everyone else, there's a whole specialized body of trade law, and it's in 19 U.S.C. 1514 outlines all these administrative procedures. It's a very complicated thing. There's got to be an administrative protest. There was a harbor management case earlier that this court was involved with in the United States Shoe, in which the refund process took a long time. There were any number of claims and equitable relief.
So a mess.
So it's difficult, absolutely. We don't deny that it's difficult, but I think what this court has said in the McKesson case in 1990 is that serious economic dislocation isn't a reason to do something. Northern Pipeline, you guys stayed your decision for a while in order to let the congressional process unfold. There may be a congressional process here as well. You may be able to also be that this court could limit its decision to prospective relief under the John Q. Hammonds case. So there's lots of possibilities.
All right, let's get into it. Today, we're going to react to and analyze a recent hearing in the United States Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation titled, Shut Your App. How Uncle Sam Jawboned Big Tech into Silencing Americans, Part 2. Tech Policy Press Plus One. The hearing explored allegations that the federal government, during the previous administration, applied pressure on major tech platforms, Meta Platforms Incorporated and Google LLC being the chief examples, to moderate, suppress, or remove content, especially relating to the COVID-19 pandemic and associated public health guidance. The focus was on what constitutes coercion, whether agencies went beyond legitimate public health or safety concerns into the realm of censorship, and how this affects free speech, the First Amendment, and ultimately the rights of everyday Americans. As we walk through this, I'll present the key facts from the hearing, lay out the arguments from both sides, and then I'll give you my own perspective, which, as you know on 45th Perspective, aims to be confidently patriotic, fact-driven, and respectful of different views. Let's begin. At the hearing, the committee heard testimony from executives of Meta and Google. For example, Neil Potts, vice president of public policy at Meta, acknowledged that Meta had received pressure from senior officials in the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, and other government entities. He stated, "To be clear, we believe that government pressure was wrong and wish we'd been more outspoken about it." Tech Policy Press, that is a striking admission. On the other hand, Markham Erickson, vice president of government affairs and public policy at Google, maintained that while Google did face pressure, they ultimately made enforcement decisions independently. "We reach our own conclusions and take enforcement action with our own determination, and sometimes that means we tell the government no." Tech Policy Press. From the Republican side, led by Ted Cruz, Republican Texas, the line of questioning strongly suggested that the government's role may have crossed what conservatives view as a red line, shifting from guidance into coercion. They pointed to internal communications, pressure campaigns, and what they viewed as suppression of dissenting views about COVID policy, vaccines, lockdowns, and other politically charged topics. From the Democratic side, represented by members such as Maria Cantwell, Democrat Washington, the focus shifted somewhat toward concerns about media platforms themselves, including broadcast networks, and whether the government's role in regulation was being similarly misused. For instance, Cantwell suggested the committee might have the right hearing, but not the right witnesses, calling attention to agencies like the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, and their potential overreach in threatening to strip broadcast licenses from networks critical of the administration. Tech Policy Press. So you see both parties are aligned around the underlying question, how far government should go, but they differ on where they see the biggest threat and who is misusing power. So what's really at issue here? At a deeper level, this hearing is about government power, private sector independence, free speech, platform moderation, public health, and the intersection of all of those in a digital age. For the everyday American, those of us who are not in boardrooms, not in regulatory agencies, this matters because it speaks directly to whether your voice can be heard, whether you can access information you think is valid, and whether the government's reach into our digital lives is appropriate and limited. Let's walk through some of the major themes and what we can take away. First, government pressure versus legitimate role. On one hand, you have the argument that during a major public health crisis, COVID-19 being unprecedented in modern times, government agencies had an obligation to alert private sector platforms about dangerous misinformation, coordinate responses, provide data, and request action. That is not in dispute. What is disputed is whether that obligation turned into coercive or oppressive measures, punishing platforms that didn't comply or partnering in ways that effectively silence particular viewpoints, especially viewpoints that now, in hindsight, may feel more politically charged than purely health-related. From the hearing, Potts's admission that Meta wished we'd been more outspoken suggests that Meta recognized some level of wrongdoing, or at least regret, in how they engaged with those requests. That is remarkable. But Google's Ericsson pushed back, saying they maintained independence. So already we see tension. The private companies themselves had different responses. My view is that the companies have a responsibility to maintain independence and the public has a right to rely on free speech platforms being free, but we also need to recognize that during a health crisis there is a legitimate role for government in coordination and in warning about threats. Second, the First Amendment, censorship, and private platforms. There is a subtle but critical issue here. The First Amendment restricts government suppression of speech, not the actions of private companies. However, if the government coerces or induces a private company to act, then it becomes government action in effect, and that raises constitutional concerns. That is the heart of the Republicans' concern. Were the pressure campaigns merely encouragement, or did they cross into coercion or mandate? Because if it's the latter, then speech rights are at risk. For ordinary Americans, the key question is this: can you trust that your voice, if it differs from the dominant narrative, can be heard without fear of being labeled misinformation or removed? If the government works behind the scenes with platforms, that trust can erode. Third, the broader implications for power and regulation. As our digital world becomes central to how we communicate, organize, inform ourselves, and debate public policy, the interplay between government, regulation, platform companies, and citizens becomes more consequential. If the government sets a precedent of working closely with platforms to moderate content in a crisis, what stops that precedent being used in other ways, political, social, or otherwise? Some of the hearing touched on this. The fear is not just about COVID, but about setting a template where government and tech collude to suppress speech. From a conservative or patriotic vantage, I believe we must protect robust freedom of speech, including dissenting views. We must also respect that government has legitimate roles, but those roles must be transparent, limited, and subject to oversight. When agencies operate behind closed doors with platforms and there is no meaningful accountability, that's where danger lies. Fourth, the public health versus free speech tension. It would be intellectually dishonest to pretend that there were no times during the pandemic when misinformation was harmful and when intervention was necessary. But we must ask, did the means justify the ends? Did the interventions stay within constitutional boundaries? Or did they tip into suppression of legitimate, albeit controversial, viewpoints? The hearing raised exactly that question. Consider the example. What if someone questioned the government's COVID policy or vaccinations and that view got labeled as misinformation and removed from a platform under pressure? If that happened, and especially if government agencies encouraged it, then yes, we have a serious problem. Fifth, what Americans should look for and what this means for you. For people just trying to go about their lives, this hearing underscores the need for transparency. Americans should demand transparency from both government agencies and big tech platforms. How decisions are made, which content is removed, why, and under what government involvement. We should demand that companies disclose when government requests or pressures moderation, and we should demand that government agencies be accountable when they ask. Because when that accountability is missing, you have one of two bad outcomes. Either private companies become de facto agents of government speech control, or the government uses private platforms to do an end run around constitutional protections. Now, let's talk about the specific arguments laid out in the hearing, and then I'll share my own take. On the Republican side, Senator Cruz and others argued that the government overstepped. They cited internal messaging, evidence of pressure, requests to remove or moderate posts, and what they described as a job-owning campaign, that is, less about formal mandates and more about implied threats or persuasion. The key worry is that because platforms comply, the public may not see the coordination and may assume the removal was purely a private company decision, when in fact government involvement may have been substantial. That lack of transparency is at odds with free speech principles. On the Democratic side, Senator Cantwell and others admitted government platform interaction but emphasized that platforms also have enormous power of their own. Control of algorithms, content moderation policies, and private decisions about what stays and what goes. They argued that we need to look at platform power just as much as government power. For example, Cantwell remarked that while this committee may have the right hearing, they might have the wrong witnesses, pointing to the FCC and broadcast licenses as additional levers of control. Tech Policy Press: The Democratic view suggests the problem is not just government pressuring platforms. It's platforms themselves wielding tremendous influence over public debate, and yes, perhaps government trying to harness that, but the solution may involve stronger regulation or transparency of the platforms themselves. From my vantage point, both sides raise valid points. On one hand, I side strongly with the idea that government must not coerce speech or use private platforms to carry out censorship. That is non-negotiable in a free society. On the other hand, I also accept the reality that platforms hold enormous power and influence, often unaccountable, and that some oversight or public accountability is appropriate. So here's how I'd frame it: we need a third way. Government should have a clearly defined and narrow best practice role in crisis communication. Yes, during a pandemic, say, an agency can supply information, coordinate with institutions, advise platforms, but must stop short of coercing platforms to suppress content. Platforms, for their part, need to be transparent about how they moderate, when they comply with government requests, and what criteria they use. And citizens, ordinary Americans, need to be vigilant. There are a few practical takeaways for you and me. If you're active online, pay attention. Which content gets removed, under what label, and how transparent the platform is about the removal. Is the government cited? Was a request made? If you consume news or commentary, question: are you seeing voices you disagree with? Or have those voices been removed or marginalized? That matters. Push your elected representatives to demand transparency from both government agencies and platforms. Accountability must be real. Recognize that in our digital age, free speech isn't just what we say in public square. It's what platforms allow, how algorithms amplify or bury our voice, and how government interacts with all of that. Another significant implication: when we allow the government to exert hidden influence behind platforms, when we accept non-transparent moderation, we risk chilling dissenting voices, we risk limiting debate, and we risk handing power over to those who decide what counts as acceptable. And that is antithetical to the American tradition of robust debate, of dissent, of challenging orthodoxy. That tradition is a strength, not a weakness. Now, I'll switch gears for a moment and offer my personal opinion, as someone committed to the Constitution, to patriotism, to the idea of free speech, and to protecting Americans' fundamental rights, but also as someone who acknowledges real responsibilities. My belief is this: the government under the previous administration likely overstepped in its relationship with platforms. That doesn't mean every request was illegitimate, or that platforms always did the wrong thing. But the risk of undue influence was real, and the fact that Meta itself acknowledged this matters. The mere possibility that a platform removed content not simply on company policy but because of implied government pressure is deeply troubling. It signals that our democratic safeguards are weaker than we hope. At the same time, I'm cautious about the opposing narrative driving us to vilify platforms completely or to pretend that private company moderation is the same as government censorship. That is a false equivalence. Private companies are not the government, but they are powerful. And when they collapse into collusion with government, we're in danger. That's why the conversation must include both sides: platform accountability and government restraint. From the patriotic lens, I see this as a call to renewal. If we want to maintain free speech, vigorous debate, and the sovereignty of the individual, we must ensure that the institutions we rely on, both government and private, are functioning in a way that respects those values. We must ensure the citizen is at the center, not agencies or tech giants. What should be done? Let's talk about reforms. Transparency requirements. Platforms should publish quarterly reports showing government requests for moderation, how many they complied with, what category of content, and whether they believed the government request was voluntary or coercive. The public has a right to know. Safe harbor protections. Private platforms should retain the ability to moderate content because there are legitimate harms, but that moderation must be clearly separated from government direction. If a government agency says, remove this, and a platform does, that should be labeled and disclosed. Congressional oversight. Committees like the Senate Commerce Committee should demand documents, communications, and transparency from agencies like CISA, the Department of Homeland Security, and others that engaged platforms. That oversight must be meaningful. Public education and media literacy. Part of the problem is the speed of information, the complexity of content moderation, and the public's limited visibility into how decisions are made. Citizens should have tools to understand how their information environment works. Platform safeguards for dissenting views. We must preserve space for legitimate dissent. Platforms should ensure that unpopular or minority viewpoints are not automatically removed or suppressed simply because they challenge orthodoxy. This doesn't mean baseless misinformation gets a free pass, but it does mean fair process and transparency. Now let's bring it back to what it means for you and me, living our lives in America today. You may not work at Google or Meta or in a regulatory agency, but you use social media, you read news, you engage in debate, you talk with friends and family, and you try to make sense of what information to trust. That's exactly why this matters. When trust erodes in these systems, when you can't reliably know whether content was removed because of moderation policy or because of government pressure, the whole information environment deteriorates. And when the information environment goes down, our ability to act as citizens, to make choices, to engage in self-governance suffers. In practical, everyday terms, you might find that an opinion you hold is flagged by a platform. You might see people you once followed being shut down. You might notice that certain themes go unchallenged, and you wonder, is this just business policy or something more? That's the tension under discussion. And in a free society, that tension must be resolved in favor of openness, transparency, and minimal government intrusion. Some might argue, but the government needed to act to protect people during the pandemic. Platforms had a role to play. So what's the big problem? And the answer is, the big problem is precedent. The fact that the government had a role does not mean that role can endlessly expand without check. If we tolerate murky, hidden coordination today, we may find ourselves locked into a system where government and big tech work hand in glove to determine permissible speech tomorrow, and that is precisely what the founding generation warned against. In my view, if Americans reclaim control of their information environment, if we demand transparency, accountability, and push back when government overreach threatens our liberties, then we can preserve the marketplace of ideas that is essential to democracy. Let me close with one more thought. The hearing itself was a necessary and healthy exercise. Whether you believe the government went too far or believe platforms aren't being held accountable enough, the fact that the Senate asked these tough questions is a win for all Americans. But we should treat hearings like this not as a one-time check, but as part of an ongoing process. Because technology, information, platforms, they evolve rapidly. Government power evolves. And our rights must evolve too, protected but also adapted. If I were to issue a challenge to you, the viewer, it's this: don't just watch headlines. Don't just read the viral sound bites. Ask, who asked for this content to be removed? Was the government involved? Is the platform transparent? And when you find irregularities, make your voice heard through letters to your representatives, through public comment periods, through conversations with your family and friends. The strength of our republic depends not just on what's written in law, but on what happens in practice, and that means it depends on us. So thank you for spending this time with me. I hope you found this breakdown helpful, thought-provoking, and grounded in facts and common-sense patriotic values. I encourage you to join the conversation below. Share your thoughts in the comments section, respectfully as fellow citizens. What do you think about the hearing? Do you believe the government overstepped? Do you believe the platforms were complicit? What protections would you like to see? Let's talk it out. If you liked this video, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And if you want to support this type of content and help us continue delivering, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/45thperspective for as little as $5 a month. Thanks again for watching. I'm proud to stand with you in seeking truth, protecting freedom, and engaging in the debates that shape our nation. Until next time, take care, stay vigilant, and keep your voice free.